March 4, 2002. Sacramento, California. Over 40 federal agents storm an abandoned storage unit, weapons drawn, breaching charges detonating the steel door. They expect an international cyber cell with military-grade servers. Instead, they find an empty concrete room, a single folding chair, and a discarded landline receiver dangling from the ceiling. The man they were chasing didn't own a house, didn't carry a smartphone, and never operated from a fixed IP address. Yet from public library terminals and payphones across 8 states, he had bypassed the internal firewalls of the Fortune 500, rerouted communications for intelligence agencies, and turned the FBI's own surveillance systems completely blind. For nearly 600 days, the Department of Justice treated him as America's most dangerous digital phantom. But when they finally cornered him, federal prosecutors discovered a secret so humiliating that the government tried to bury the case transcripts for over a decade. How did a lone transient with zero institutional backing humiliate the world's most sophisticated cyber task force? And what classified flaw did he uncover inside their networks that forced Washington to cut a deal? Before this story ends, you'll see the payphone in a Reno bus terminal where the entire operation nearly collapsed in 90 seconds. You'll see the internal FBI memo, later stamped classified, admitting their own agents had exposed themselves. You'll see the exact moment a federal prosecutor realized her airtight case had a hole the size of a filing cabinet. You'll see the spiral notebook that a federal judge personally ordered, sealed for 11 years. And you'll see why, when the sentence finally came down, it wasn't the one anyone in that courtroom expected. This is the file the Bureau never wanted read into public record. This is Black File Investigations. And this is the case of the man agent's internal paperwork listed only as Subject Whisper, a name investigators would later confirm belonged to a 34-year-old former telecom technician named Marcus Reyes. Reyes had spent 6 years wiring central offices for a regional carrier headquartered in Reno before a round of layoffs put him on the street in the winter of 1999. Co-workers who were interviewed later described a man who treated the switching room the way other people treat a hobby workshop, arriving early, staying late, running diagnostic checks nobody had asked him to run. He didn't disappear into obscurity after the layoff. He disappeared into infrastructure. Reyes understood something most subscribers never think about. The telephone network isn't a simple grid of copper wire. It's a hierarchy of switches and trunk lines constantly signaling to each other, authenticating calls, routing them, billing them, through a protocol layer most engineers only touch during training. He had spent nearly a decade inside that architecture, tracing fault conditions with a handheld test set clipped to his belt, and he knew its blind spots better than the people who'd designed the network standards themselves. A public library terminal in Elko gave him internet access tied to no subscriber name. A payphone gave him a voice line the carrier logged only by trunk position, never by caller identity. He needed nothing else. No apartment lease, no cell phone contract, no fixed address for a federal warrant to reach. The official story, the one that made it into the first wave of local press coverage, was simple, almost forgettable. In late 2000, a regional bank in Fresno reported unauthorized wire transfers totaling $340,000, routed through 3 shell accounts before disappearing into a Caribbean clearinghouse. Local detectives treated it as garden-variety wire fraud, the kind of case that earns a case number, 4 paragraphs in the Metro section, and nothing else. The FBI's Sacramento field office picked it up almost as an afterthought, assigning it to a mid-level financial crime squad rather than the cyber division 2 floors up. For nearly 4 months, that's exactly what it looked like. A contained, almost amateur scheme. Investigators traced the shell accounts through 3 layers of correspondent banking, subpoenaed the Fresno branch's wire authorization logs, and built a working theory. An insider, or someone close to one, had exploited a lax secondary verification process on transfers above $250,000. Special Agent Lisa Hartwell, a 12-year veteran who'd cut her teeth on securities fraud before rotating into financial crimes, ran the case with the confidence of someone who had seen this exact pattern 100 times before. She sat across the table from 3 Fresno tellers over the course of a week, watching their hands, watching how long each one took to answer a simple question about the transfer date. She requested badge swipe logs for the branch's back office going back 90 days. By every internal metric the Bureau tracks for case progression, Hartwell was doing everything right. One of those three tellers was a 26-year-old named Elena Vasquez, who had processed the wire transfer at the center of the case without a second thought, exactly the way she'd been trained to. Vasquez spent 11 days on administrative leave while the branch's fraud department reviewed her file, unable to explain to her landlord why her paycheck had stopped arriving on schedule, unable to say anything to her coworkers beyond, "It's under review." She wasn't the insider. There was no insider. But for those 11 days, the case file treated her like one, and nobody in Sacramento thought to tell her otherwise until the reassignment to Cyber Division made the question moot. Her name appears in the file only once more after that, a single line noting she was formally cleared in March 2001, more than a year after the transfer that had put her job on hold. What Hartwell didn't know, what nobody in that office knew yet, was that the wire transfer itself had been the easy part of the scheme. The real operation had started weeks earlier and it hadn't touched a single bank computer. It had touched the phone system responsible for verifying the bank's own security callbacks. When the Fresno branch's fraud department dialed the customer back to confirm a transfer that size, that call itself was being silently rerouted through a diverted trunk line Reyes could access from a service closet 3 blocks from the Elko library. The bank's own verification protocol, the specific safeguard engineered to catch exactly this kind of fraud, was the mechanism Reyes had quietly turned inside out. The break came from a source nobody in Sacramento expected: a routine phone company billing audit. A junior fraud analyst at the carrier, cross-checking call detail records for an unrelated quarterly review, flagged a callback authorization line that had been rerouted for exactly 11 minutes on the night of the Fresno transfer, then rerouted back, as if it had never moved at all. She didn't understand what the anomaly meant. She filed an internal ticket anyway, out of habit more than suspicion, and that ticket sat untouched in a queue for 6 weeks before a federal subpoena finally pulled it into the Bureau's case file. Agent Hartwell read the ticket twice, sitting at her desk with the fluorescent office lights humming overhead, before she picked up the phone to call her supervisor. The verification call didn't go where it was supposed to go, she told Special Agent in Charge Daniel Okafor, according to testimony later entered into the record. Somebody rerouted a landline. That's not a bank problem. That's a phone company problem. Okafor's response, also preserved in the file, was blunt. Then this isn't financial crimes anymore. Within 72 hours, the case was formally reassigned to the Cyber Division, and Hartwell's working theory, an inside job at a single Fresno branch, collapsed entirely. Somebody outside the bank, outside the city, had reached directly into the telecommunications infrastructure and manipulated the exact system built to prevent this kind of fraud. The Cyber Division's first real break didn't come from tracing Reyes forward. It came from tracing the technique backward. A former colleague of Reyes at the Nevada carrier, interviewed as a matter of routine, mentioned almost in passing during a 40-minute interview that a technician who used to work there understood the switch architecture better than anyone I ever met, and he left angry. That single sentence redirected the entire investigation. Agents pulled Reyes's old personnel file, his termination paperwork, and a 2-year-old grievance he'd filed with the carrier's Human Resources Department, alleging he'd been scapegoated for a regional outage that internal records showed wasn't his fault at all. It wasn't proof of anything. But it was the first real name anyone in the case file had attached to a living person. What the Bureau found next changed the scale of the investigation entirely. The Fresno transfer wasn't an isolated event. Analysts cross-referenced call rerouting anomalies against 6 months of carrier billing data across 3 states and identified 11 similar incidents. Banks, a credit union in Boise, and in one case, a county courthouse's bail bond verification line in Medford, Oregon, all sharing the same signature. A brief surgical reroute of a callback authorization number, executed and reversed within minutes, leaving almost no trace unless an investigator knew exactly which billing record to pull. Reyes wasn't running a single scheme. He'd built something closer to a toll operation, quietly renting the technique's execution, never the method itself, through an encrypted bulletin board frequented by a small, insular circle of phone phreakers and low-level fraud operators. Every job was executed from a different payphone in a different town, and paid through the same layered account structure the Fresno bank had first reported. Agents eventually estimated the total volume moved through the scheme, across all 11 confirmed incidents, at just over $2.1 million. modest by cartel standards, but staggering for a man with no fixed address and no machine anyone could point to as his own. The Medford courthouse incident was the one that unsettled investigators most, precisely because it had nothing to do with banking at all. A bail bondsman's office relied on the same class of callback verification to confirm a defendant's surety payment before a judge would sign a release order. Reyes's technique, rented out for a flat fee through the bulletin board, rerouted that confirmation call for 6 minutes on a Tuesday afternoon in September 2001, long enough for a fraudulent surety payment to clear and a defendant named in a separate, unrelated federal wiretap investigation to walk out of the Jackson County Jail before agents watching the case realized what had happened. He was recaptured 9 weeks later in Spokane. The incident report on that single rerouted phone call ran to 14 pages, and it was the first document in the file that used the word counterintelligence concern instead of fraud. The scale of the operation forced a decision nobody in the Sacramento field office wanted to make. If Reyes could manipulate carrier-level call routing at will, he wasn't only a fraud problem. He was a potential access point into any institution that relied on telephone-based verification, including, as one internal memo later conceded under pressure from defense attorneys, portions of the Bureau's own regional field communications. Sacramento requested support from the FBI's National Cyber Division Task Force in Washington. A joint operation codenamed internally as Fractured Line was formally authorized in January 2001. For the next 13 months, Fractured Line became one of the most resource-intensive manhunts the Sacramento field office had ever run for a crime, with no violence and no weapon. Agents staked out library branches in 3 states, logging hours in unmarked sedans with cold coffee and long-lens cameras aimed at rows of public terminals. They subpoenaed payphone billing logs across the western region. They built a geographic profile from call origin points, watching a pattern slowly take shape, a deliberate loop through Nevada, California, and Oregon that never repeated the same city twice in a single month. Reyes, it turned out, was reading their movements almost as closely as they were reading his. Twice during that surveillance window, agents believed they had him. In August 2001, a 2-man team watched a man matching Reyes's build enter a Boise public library at 4:40 in the afternoon and approach the terminal bank only to find the session already logged out. The chair still warm, no trace on the machine beyond a browser history scrubbed clean. In October, a Eugene police officer responding to an unrelated call ran a plate on a parked sedan 2 blocks from a flagged payphone and got a hit on a stolen vehicle report from Elko County, the same city where Reyes had once worked the switching room. By the time backup arrived, the sedan was gone. Agent Hartwell, who had stayed on the task force even after the case moved out from under her original squad, would later describe the surveillance period in a deposition as chasing a man who always seemed to know which street we were standing on before we did. Deep dive investigations into suppressed files and institutional failures take hundreds of hours of forensic research, court record retrieval, and archival reconstruction to put together accurately. If you value independent documentation of cases that mainstream networks refuse to cover, consider supporting our work directly via the Buy Me a Coffee link in the pinned comment below. Your support is what keeps investigations like this one free from corporate sponsorship and algorithmic compromise, and free to go into the detail the 6 o'clock news never will. The case turned in February 2002, and it turned on a mistake so small, the Bureau's own after-action report later called it a procedural footnote that became the entire investigation. A field agent running routine surveillance on a Reno bus terminal payphone, flagged in the geographic model, photographed a man matching Reyes's old employment ID, down to a distinctive scar above his left eyebrow, using the phone for what the surveillance log timed at 93 seconds. It wasn't a transaction. It was Reyes checking a voicemail drop he used to communicate with a single, trusted associate, standing with his shoulder against the plexiglass hood, one hand cupped around the receiver against the noise of an idling bus. The photograph, combined with a partial fingerprint lifted from that same receiver 2 days later, gave agents their first physical confirmation in 14 months that Subject Whisper and Marcus Reyes were the same man. What happened during the March 4th raid on the Sacramento storage unit is where the official case file and the truth begin to diverge, and where the story stops being about Reyes alone. Agents had traced the unit to a lease paid in cash under one of Reyes's known aliases and expected to find, at minimum, hardware, a laptop, a modem, something to justify 13 months of task force resources and the overtime pay attached to it. What the entry team found instead, under the glare of tactical flashlights sweeping bare concrete, was a single folding chair, a disconnected landline receiver hanging from a coiled cord, and a spiral notebook sitting square in the center of the chair's seat, as if it had been left there on purpose. Reyes hadn't been arrested in that room. He'd been arrested 4 days earlier at a payphone outside a Sparks, Nevada shopping center, calmly finishing a call when 2 agents approached from opposite ends of the parking lot. He didn't run. He set the receiver back on the hook, according to the arresting agent's report, and waited. The notebook is what changed everything. Inside, in Reyes's own handwriting, agents found something no one in the Bureau wanted entered into open court. A hand-drawn diagram of the exact vulnerability in FBI field communications that had first pushed Sacramento to treat this as more than a bank fraud case. Reyes hadn't stumbled onto it by accident. During the 13 months he'd spent evading surveillance, he had, deliberately, methodically, mapped the same legacy callback verification weakness inside portions of the Bureau's own regional command line, the identical class of flaw his fraud scheme had already exploited against 3 banks and a courthouse. He had never used it against the agents chasing him. His attorney would later argue, and prosecutors would quietly concede in a sealed pre-trial hearing, that Reyes had kept the notebook specifically because he understood its value, not as a weapon to deploy but as a card to hold in reserve. The technical review team that examined the notebook took 9 days to write their internal assessment, and the assessment itself, according to the portions later declassified, was unusually blunt for an internal Bureau document. The reviewing engineer noted that the diagram wasn't theoretical. It described, in Reyes's precise technician's handwriting, a specific class of legacy trunk line still in limited use for regional field office communications. Equipment scheduled for replacement under a modernization budget that, as of the notebook's discovery, had been delayed twice by Congress. Reyes had annotated 2 pages with dates, the first marking when he'd confirmed the vulnerability existed, the second nearly 5 months later, marking when he'd confirmed it was still unpatched. He had been watching the Bureau's own infrastructure the entire time the Bureau had been watching him. When Assistant U.S. Attorney Rebecca Cho, the lead prosecutor assigned to the case, first read the technical assessment attached to the notebook, she reportedly closed the file, walked to her supervisor's office, and asked a question that would end up shaping the entire remainder of the case. If this goes to trial and gets read into the record, who exactly are we protecting anymore? The public or ourselves? There was no clean answer. The fraud case against Reyes was, by every prosecutorial standard, one of the strongest her office had built that year. The notebook made it radioactive. Federal prosecutors were left with a case that was airtight on the original wire fraud charges and radioactive on almost everything else. Taking Reyes to a public trial meant entering in open court a working diagram of a communications vulnerability inside federal law enforcement infrastructure. Precisely the kind of document that becomes a roadmap the moment a court reporter transcribes it into public record. Under 18 U.S.C. paragraph 1030, prosecutors had more than enough evidence for a lengthy sentence on the fraud counts alone. What they didn't have was a way to secure that sentence without handing the defense, and by extension the public record, a functional manual for exploiting the Bureau's own operational weaknesses. The result was a plea agreement, finalized in September 2002 and sealed by a federal judge for 11 years before select portions were declassified following a Freedom of Information Act request filed in 2013. Reyes pleaded guilty to wire fraud and unauthorized access to a protected computer system, receiving 41 months, a fraction of the sentence federal sentencing guidelines would ordinarily recommend for more than $2 million in fraud spanning 3 states. In exchange, the notebook and its contents were placed under a permanent protective order, sealed from public inspection indefinitely. Reyes never spoke publicly about what he'd found inside the Bureau's own network. The vulnerability itself, according to a heavily redacted 2004 Inspector General's report, was quietly patched 18 months after his arrest, long after Fractured Line had already been closed out on paper as a routine, unremarkable fraud conviction. Agent Hartwell, the analyst who had first flagged the rerouted callback line that unraveled the entire scheme, never worked another cybercrime case after Fractured Line closed. She transferred to a white-collar squad in a different district 8 months later, and in her 2019 deposition, taken as part of the FOIA litigation that eventually forced portions of the file into daylight, she was asked directly whether she believed justice had been served. Her answer, preserved verbatim in the transcript, was 3 words long. Define which justice. So who really came out ahead in the case of Marcus Reyes? A man with no house, no phone contract, and no institutional power forced one of the most resourced law enforcement agencies on Earth to negotiate almost entirely on his terms, simply because he understood their own infrastructure better than the people who built it. Both things are true here at once. Reyes defrauded real people, real banks, and a real courthouse bond system, and federal prosecutors still made a calculated decision to let a convicted felon walk with a fraction of the sentence he could have received, because the alternative, his knowledge, read into open court, was judged more dangerous than the crime itself. This case made it to the channel. Not everyone does. So, who really won this fight? The phantom who forced the Bureau to negotiate on his terms, or the agency that buried the file for over a decade rather than admit how close it came to losing control of its own network? Leave your answer below. Half of you are about to disagree with the other half.